So hello again, this is Steph West. I'm an LPC here in the state of Michigan, and I wanted to share probably what's the nerdiest thing that I love talking about with my clients, and that's what's actually going on in our brain when anxiety is upticking. And it starts at the basic understanding, and I like to use the analogy of a treadmill. Imagine that we have the belt on a treadmill, and as I'm upticking the speed, it starts to generate energy quicker and quicker. And eventually, if I don't harness that energy well, I'm going to get booted off the treadmill. And in essence, that's something that our brain is doing as we go through thinking and as we go through kind of day-to-day problem solving. There's actual rotations going on in our brain. So I'm going to reference to rotations per second. Now think of that intensity, right? If I'm talking about 4 rotations per second versus 30 rotations per second, that is a vast difference, and it's happening in the brain waves. And as it relates to anxiety, it's really helpful to understand once we get to a certain point where our brain waves are going at a cadence that's unsustainable, then we have choices to make, and not even rational choices at that point in time. Our body or our emotions or our behaviors might just respond because there's too much momentum going. And so I want to give you a little bit of understanding about that. So up on the board here, we have the different brain waves that happen. Now, if you go into the literature, there are some slight discrepancies with the certain rotations per second at each of the brain waves. So if I say it's 0 to 4 and some literature says it's 0 to 3, I'm not trying to be intentionally duplicitous. There's just some variances in the numbers. But I want to explain what's going on at each brain wave level, and hopefully that can help you understand kind of in general, when I'm at a relaxed state, this is what's happening. When I'm at a heightened state, this is what's happening. So when we talk about, really it's 0 to 4 rotations per second at the delta waves, that's in a totally calm sleep state. Nothing's really rousing us. When we're talking about theta, we're talking about kind of we're being roused somewhat, but we're still in a really relaxed state, and that's going about 4 to 7 rotations per second in your brain. That's a very slow cadence. That's very sustainable energy. Then we go to the alpha waves, and the alpha waves are when we're having kind of casual conversation. We're being, somewhat social. We're having to think about things gently or lightly. Maybe we're watching something that's, a touch stimulating. So those are going to be places where rotations per second are upticking, but we're not generating a lot of energy yet. Now, anxiety lives in the beta waves, and we have 5 beta waves, and again, there's variance in numbers depending on the sources that you read, but usually beta waves goes anywhere from like 12 rotations per second up to about 30, 32, some literature even says 36 rotations per second. But what you need to know is that's where anxiety is generated, and that's where it lives. And so when we're talking about low-level anxiety, so I'm having like 13 to 16 rotations per second, again, per second is the key here. That's a very fast cadence that's building. I'm talking about low-level anxiety that's running. Now, if you're out there trying to learn something, you're engaged in problem solving, and you're on top of it, you're generating energy and you're doing something constructive with it, and that's a-okay. We don't call that anxiety. It's as we build energy and we don't know how to harness it well, that's where anxiety lives. That's where we're having an energy response in the body, and energy's got to go somewhere, and if we don't know what to do with it, it can come out quite chaotically. So as we build into our beta waves, now we're at beta 2, we're about 17 to 20 rotations per second. Beta 3, 21 to 24 rotations per second. So we see it increase in its intensity. Up to beta 4, 25 to 28 rotations per second. Beta 5, now we're going to 30, 31, 32 rotations per second. There's a vast difference between low level, I'm having a sense of dis-ease, 14, 15 rotations per second, to, I have 30 rotations per second going on, and the energy is generating and I don't know what to do with it. Now, the mind can cope with that in a whole host of ways. It can dissociate, so it can kind of offload things. So now you're not worrying about the situation because you're kind of just disconnected from yourself. Some people at that point are doing things that numb or self-soothe, so it can help bring down their level of stress. Some people lash out because this energy is generated and it has to go somewhere. So there's a whole host of things that can happen when the energy is running unchecked. Now, we don't want to say that anything in beta is a bad thing or anything in gamma. So gamma is when we get above those beta waves. That's where it becomes a really big energy burst. We don't want to say that's a bad thing in and of itself. That's actually where flow state happens. If you're harnessing it in a direction and it's productive, awesome. It's okay to have that cadence build. But if you're building up that momentum and we have nowhere to go with it, that's where some responses come up that might be unpredictable or unwarranted or just not something that we want to be engaging. And so what we want to understand is, as I'm upticking, I have a responsibility to say, do I need to do something here to take the edge off? Do I need to do something here to lower the cadence that I'm building? Because if I keep going, unfortunately, I might lose control of this situation. And so I talk to clients quite often. I say, okay, I wonder if, because you're in a season of distress, maybe you're kind of hanging out at a 17 to a 20 on the regular, or maybe you're hanging out at a 21 to a 24 rotations on the regular because you're just in a season of high distress. If that's true, our goal isn't to take away anxiety. Our goal is to say, how do I go down a level? How do I go down a level? Anxiety in and of itself is not a bad thing. Anxiety is something that prompts us into movement. It prompts us into change. It prompts us into motion. So in and of itself, it's not a bad thing. It's when it's not harnessed well or when it runs unchecked that it can become really complicated to deal with. It can become more of an impedance to relationships. It can be an impedance to health. It can be something where we experience a high level of distress. And so as we go through this with clients, I ask them to think, what are some interventions that might help us go from a beta 4 to a beta 3? So maybe I could do some regulated breathing. Maybe I could reach out to a friend and talk. Maybe I could reach out to a therapist and process through some of the big things that are going on. Maybe I can problem solve, and we've talked about this in other videos. What does it look like to build up resources? Is it possible to pull other things in or other people in that are going to help stymie some of that overactivity going on in my brain? And so the point of this video is just to say there's a physiological response and there's a generation of energy that's happening as our anxiety upticks. And so we have a real responsibility to really bring in interventions that help us quell some of the upheaval, especially if we don't know how to harness it well. Now, if you do know how to harness it well and building energy is just this creative force in you, awesome, go forth and do that. But for some people, it's unmanaged. It's hard to wrangle it in appropriate channels or appropriate directions. And that's where interventions are going to be key. So if you need more information about that, feel free to reach out. Feel free to leave comments here. You're welcome to reach out to me. I have an email address set up at healingthroughpain21@gmail.com. That's in tandem with the podcast that I run, which is also called Healing Through Pain. But I would love to hear feedback from you. And if you have science numbers that say different, not science numbers, if you have numbers that say differently, that's to be understood, or that's to be expected, because in the literature there are some variances there. But if you go through and look, what does it mean to kind of build intensity in our brainwaves, and what does that mean related to anxiety? Hopefully this particular video shed some light on that. Thanks so much.